You obstructed a police officer. The accusation rang out like gospel. You refused lawful orders, resisted arrest, and raised your voice in a public setting. If that had been the whole truth, this case would have been over by lunch. But then she stood up, measured, composed, unflinching, and the story began to unravel faster than the press could reload their cameras. The woman they tried to humiliate in court? That wasn't just any defendant. That was Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, and she had no intention of playing the part they wrote for her. Now, what kind of courtroom hears a routine misdemeanor and ends up cracking open the state's most uncomfortable truths? The kind where someone makes the catastrophic mistake of picking the wrong black woman to target. It began in a high-ceilinged courtroom in Albany, where the early morning light tried and failed to soften the tension buzzing in the air. Spectators filled the benches, State House aides, reporters, activist lawyers, and a few off-duty cops with folded arms and narrowed eyes. And in the middle of it all sat Letitia, perfectly still. Her tailored navy suit was sharp, her pearl earrings understated, but her presence, it cut through the noise like a quiet warning. No phone scrolling, no shifting in her seat. Just a woman watching, calculating. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Edward Grayson entered with the look of a man who thought he was prepared, until he wasn't. State of New York versus Letitia A. James, the bailiff announced, and somewhere in the gallery a reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. Letitia rose. No hesitation, no drama, just clean, professional motion, like someone accustomed to addressing institutions, not submitting to them. But across the aisle, Officer Bradley Simmons leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk. In full uniform, brass gleaming, posture smug, he looked like the embodiment of unchecked confidence. 10 years on the force, and not a single charge that ever stuck. Until now. Simmons didn't even glance at Letitia as he strutted to the witness stand. He adjusted his belt, cleared his throat, and performed the oath with the kind of theatricality that made you wish someone would yell, "Cut." Letitia didn't blink. She merely folded her hands, watching like a prosecutor who had just switched seats with her own client. Simmons began. I received a call regarding a disturbance near Clinton Avenue. Upon arrival, I observed Ms. James standing alone outside a government building, refusing to disperse when asked. Murmurs rose immediately. What kind of disturbance involves the Attorney General standing on a public sidewalk? Simmons plowed forward. She was agitated, refused to identify herself, became verbally aggressive, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically shoved me and attempted to reach for my firearm. The gallery stiffened. Letitia didn't move. Simmons, clearly enjoying the spotlight, pressed on with his performance. At that point, he said gravely, I had no choice but to restrain her for officer safety. From the second row, a woman muttered under her breath, If you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. Grayson's gavel struck twice. Order in the court. The judge turned back toward the witness. Thank you, Officer Simmons. You may step down. Simmons nodded, his smirk barely concealed, as if the applause for his fiction had been well earned. But across the aisle, Letitia James hadn't flinched once. She had heard it all before. She just hadn't responded. Yet. Judge Grayson's gavel hadn't even cooled when Jordan Ellis, Letitia's counsel, made the fatal rookie mistake of sounding like a man still asking for permission in a room full of wolves. Your Honor, before we continue. But the judge, whose patience was clearly in short supply that morning, waved him off like a summer gnat. Save it for Cross, Mr. Ellis. Let's move on. It wasn't cruel, just bureaucratic exhaustion with a twist of judicial indifference. Letitia didn't even blink. She leaned in with the calm of someone who'd filed more lawsuits than Ellis had read briefs. "Stay calm. Stick to the facts," she whispered. It wasn't advice. It was a lifeline. Across the room, Officer Simmons slithered back into his seat like a man returning to his throne. His smirk, which earlier had merely hinted at self-congratulation, now bloomed into a full-grown grin. And why not? His testimony, so rich in cliches and so poor in plausibility, had been swallowed whole by the court without even the courtesy of a follow-up question. Letitia caught the wink he shot toward the back row of uniformed colleagues, a silent salute to the blue wall. Apparently, humility wasn't part of standard police training. "Ms. James," the judge said, this time with a pinch more skepticism, as though wondering how the state's top legal officer had ended up on the wrong end of a misdemeanor. "It's your turn." Letitia stood. No theatrics, no courtroom dramatics, just the grace of a woman who'd been called worse things in nastier rooms. As she approached the stand, the room tensed. She adjusted the microphone with the patience of someone used to being interrupted by men in expensive suits, then waited. She didn't speak to impress the jury. She spoke like she was building a record. "I can explain, certainly," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "But let's start with the obvious. The officer's version is not just inaccurate. It's engineered." That word dropped like a brick in a quiet church. The prosecutor, one of those slick types with a lapel pin and not a single conviction above shoplifting, arched a brow. "Engineered, Ms. James. That's quite the accusation. Do you have proof?" Letitia stared at him. Not cold, not hostile, just unimpressed. "The truth doesn't always come with a timestamp and a logo, counsel, but it always arrives." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Even his tie seemed to deflate. Letitia began her account, voice steady as granite. "That night, I was returning home from an outreach event. I stopped briefly to check directions on my phone. Pause. Let it settle. That's when Officer Simmons approached." "So this was unprovoked?" the prosecutor asked, practically wagging his finger like a cable news anchor auditioning for outrage. Letitia tilted her head. "I was standing on a sidewalk, not swinging a bat, not blocking traffic, not committing a felony by glancing at Google Maps. He pointed a flashlight in my face and asked, 'What are you doing here?' "And how did you respond?" he pressed. "I told him. I said I was checking directions. He asked for my ID. I asked if I'd done anything wrong." The prosecutor pounced. "So you challenged his authority?" "I questioned his motive," she corrected. "He hadn't accused me of any crime. I wanted to know why I was being stopped. That's not insubordination. That's the Constitution." The gallery murmured. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel once, more out of habit than conviction. Letitia continued, tone measured. "When I asked for clarification, he raised his voice. He said I was being uncooperative. I said I wasn't looking for trouble, but before I could finish, he grabbed my arm." That landed with a thud. The prosecutor raised a skeptical eyebrow, clearly calculating how much sarcasm he could inject without triggering an objection. "Are you saying the officer physically restrained you? Without cause?" "Yes," she replied, nodding once. "And when I told him to release me, he tightened his grip. Then he said, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn how to listen.'" Gasps erupted. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel with more urgency this time, but the damage was done. The phrase echoed in the air like a racial slur left hanging on a microphone. "That's a serious accusation," the prosecutor said, attempting a smirk that looked more like indigestion. "Do you have proof?" Letitia turned to him, voice like a scalpel. "Number, because his body camera malfunctioned. Isn't that right, Officer Simmons?" All heads swiveled. The officer who once looked bulletproof now looked like someone caught speed reading his Miranda rights. The jaw clenched, the eyes narrowed, and the narrative he built with such pomp, it just got its first fracture. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Let's return to the facts, Ms. James." She nodded once as if to say, "Oh, don't worry, we're just getting started." The silence that followed Letitia's last words wasn't ordinary. It was the kind that made grown men clear their throats and prosecutors recheck their notes for a trap they might have just walked into. Judge Grayson, visibly unsettled, glanced down as though the law itself had suddenly become too ambiguous to anchor his next move. The prosecutor, on the other hand, looked like someone trying to bluff his way through a poker game with his cards facing out. "What happened next?" he asked, hoping to drag Letitia back into the safe confines of procedural theater. But Letitia, as always, didn't play safe. She played accurate. "I told him I didn't consent to being touched," she said, folding her hands. "I asked him to let go. He didn't. Instead, he accused me of resisting arrest, even though I hadn't moved an inch." That line hit the courtroom like a slap across the face. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen stopped scribbling. Letitia kept going. When I instinctively tried to pull my arm away, he slammed me into the patrol car, with force, with intent, and without justification. The audience stirred. Not a cough, not a shift, just a collective realization that this wasn't a mugshot moment. It was a flashpoint. And then, the prosecutor's tone had shed its swagger. Letitia didn't flinch. Then he handcuffed me and said I was under arrest for assaulting an officer. The irony hung in the air like smoke from a burning constitution. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, desperate to reclaim some narrative real estate. "Ms. James, you're a strong woman. Is it possible the officer felt threatened by your physical resistance?" It was the kind of question that wouldn't survive a Tuesday night community board meeting, let alone a courtroom. Letitia stared him down with the precision of a woman who'd built her career dismantling that exact brand of rhetorical laziness. "I'm not stronger than a trained police officer," she said coolly. "And let's be clear. I didn't resist until he violated my rights. But I suppose that line doesn't print well on a police report, does it?" The prosecutor opened his mouth, but Letitia sliced in before the spin cycle could begin. "And I never reached for his weapon. That accusation is fiction, a convenient bit of theater to justify an overreach he never expected to be questioned." The room froze. Simmons, who had been riding high on the fumes of institutional arrogance, shifted in his seat. His face didn't crumble, it buckled. The prosecutor's face reddened. "So," he pressed, voice tight, "you're telling this court that Officer Simmons, a decorated member of the NYPD, fabricated the entire encounter?" Letitia didn't blink. "I'm telling you the truth doesn't care how many medals someone pins to a uniform. Fabrication doesn't need a cape. It just needs confidence and silence. Fortunately, I'm short on both." A faint smile crept across her lips. Not smug, not cruel, but tactical. "The truth always reveals itself, counselor. You'll see soon enough." The judge leaned forward. "Ms. James, are you implying there is evidence the court has not yet reviewed?" Jordan Ellis, who had up until now resembled a graduate intern caught in an episode of Law and Order, shot up. "Your Honor, the defense intends to submit additional evidence during these proceedings." The prosecutor scoffed, an actual audible scoff. "Stalling tactics," he muttered. "If they had anything real, they'd have brought it by now." Letitia turned her head, calm, cold, focused. "The truth takes time," she said, "but when it shows up, it tends to make a mess of certainty." The judge studied her for a long second, then nodded. "Very well. We'll recess for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel fell, the room erupted into anxious whispers. Letitia rose from the stand with the elegance of someone used to walking away from broken narratives. She passed Officer Simmons without even a glance, though his sudden need to study the grain of the courtroom table suggested he was already seeing shadows where there'd been none. Jordan leaned in. "Are you sure about this?" His voice wobbled between reverence and fear. Letitia placed a hand on his forearm. "Trust me, Jordan. Tomorrow, the truth will speak louder than anything Simmons ever rehearsed." They walked out into the gold-lit haze of a New York sunset, courthouse steps humming with speculation and iPhones held high like offerings to the gods of viral content. Letitia paused at the edge. The war was far from over, but she'd been through worse, much worse, and this was just another theater of combat. Jordan caught up beside her, his expression still wrapped in disbelief. "We need to talk," he said, lowering his voice. "I can feel it. The judge knows it. The prosecutor knows it. Simmons knows it. You're sitting on something, and I can't walk back in there tomorrow blind." Letitia's smile returned, quiet and razor-edged. "You'll know when it's time." "That's not enough," he pressed. "I'm your lawyer. I can't protect you from what I don't understand." She studied him, measured, surgical, then nodded. "Come to my place tonight. I'll tell you everything." He blinked. "You will?" "I will," she repeated, her tone one part invitation, two parts warning. "But not here." Because the truth deserved a better stage than this circus had provided so far. Letitia James Brooklyn Brownstone didn't look like the headquarters of a counteroffensive, but then again, that was the point. No marble pillars, no armed guards, just a porch light glowing over brick steps and a flag hanging quietly beside the door, the kind that meant something more than decoration. Jordan Ellis arrived with the wariness of a man who just realized his client might be more dangerous to her enemies than they'd hoped. He stepped out of his car, ears still ringing from the courtroom chaos, and walked up the gravel path like someone approaching a live grenade. Letitia opened the door before he even knocked. Navy sweatshirt, leggings, no makeup, hair pulled back. The same woman, different armor. "Come in," she said simply, as if the fate of a police department wasn't currently dangling over her living room. Jordan entered like he was stepping into the war room of a 4-star general. And, in a way, he was. The place was clean, unpretentious, and surgical in its symbolism. A photo of Letitia in uniform beside a fellow officer, both in their prime. A folded flag in a glass case that whispered of burial honors and inconvenient patriotism. And books, rows of them, titles on law, resistance, and the architecture of American power, all shelved like weapons. "You live alone?" he asked, mostly to fill the air. "For now," she replied, gesturing to the couch. "Drink?" "Number, I'm here for answers. No distractions." "Good," she said, walking to the bookshelf, "because you're about to get all of them." She returned with a leather-bound folder, worn, frayed, but dignified, like everything else about her. She dropped it on the coffee table with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what a file like that could do to a prosecutor's blood pressure. "My service record." Jordan hesitated. "You're serious?" "I'm giving you what Simmons never thought he'd have to face. Context." He opened it, and whatever part of him still thought this was a routine civil liberties case died somewhere between the first commendation and the deployment logs. "Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL," he muttered. "Retired. I served this country longer than Simmons has been lying to it," Letitia said coolly, "and I've survived things he couldn't even pronounce." Jordan sat back, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was never about me," she said. "This is about what he represents. The entire rotten scaffolding that holds men like him in place while the system applauds." Jordan ran a hand through his hair. "This'll detonate the courtroom, the press. He's going to implode." Letitia shook her head. "Men like Simmons don't implode. They harden. They lie bigger. That's why we have to go beyond him. We can't just expose his lies. We have to dismantle the shield that lets him hide behind a badge and a union rep." Jordan nodded slowly, the gravity finally sinking in. "You think he suspects?" "He doesn't know," she said. "But he smells it. The way he looked at me today, that was fear pretending to be disdain." Jordan closed the folder. "So, what's the plan?" Letitia stood, her casual clothes suddenly looking like tactical gear. She picked up the folded flag from the mantel and turned it in her hands. "We make them see me. Not as a defendant, not as some angry black woman resisting authority, but as the woman who risked her life for a constitution he treats like toilet paper." Her voice was calm, but it vibrated with an energy that made the room feel like a charged circuit. "Tomorrow's going to be a fight," Jordan said. "I've been fighting my whole life," she replied. "Tomorrow's just a different battlefield." And as dawn broke over the courthouse steps, it seemed the city knew it. The crowd that had gathered wasn't here for spectacle. They were here for blood. Legal, reputational, institutional. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a live wire. Reporters scribbled. Cops lined the back row, blue wall intact, and at the defense table Letitia James sat, still, focused, unreadable, the eye of a political storm. And Simmons. Well, he had no idea what was about to hit him. Letitia's blazer that morning wasn't just pressed, it was weaponized. The navy fabric caught the light like polished steel, and the crisp white shirt beneath it gleamed like a warning to anyone foolish enough to mistake civility for submission. She didn't just sit at the defense table. She held court before the judge even entered. Jordan Ellis, seated beside her, fidgeted like a man trying to translate legal Latin into plain English while riding a roller coaster. His pen tapped a silent SOS. "Are you ready for this?" he whispered. Letitia turned just enough to meet his eye. "I've been ready since the first man in a uniform tried to tell me silence was safer than truth." The gavel cracked like thunder. "Game on." Judge Grayson entered with the rigid composure of a man who long ago made peace with moral ambiguity. "Court is now in session. We will continue with the case of State versus Letitia James." The prosecutor, whose face was a PowerPoint presentation of smugness, stood with a smirk tailored to fit his overpriced suit. "Your Honor, we intend to bolster Officer Simmons's testimony with further context." Translation: let's see if we can polish a lie until it shines like probable cause. Simmons, now returned to the stand, looked like a man who had walked in wearing armor but discovered it was made of tinfoil. His movements were stiff, no longer dramatic, just cautious. "As I stated before," he recited, "the defendant was acting suspiciously and became physically aggressive." Suspicious, of course, being that mystical code word for blackened breathing. "And you stand by that?" the prosecutor asked, already fishing for reassurance. "I do," Simmons said, his voice firm but posture betraying the ghost of yesterday's unraveling. He glanced at Letitia, 1 second too long, one blink too slow. Jordan rose like a shadow taking shape, voice calm but honed to a scalpel's edge. "Officer Simmons, just to clarify, you claim my client became aggressive and reached for your weapon?" "That's correct." "And your body camera?" "It malfunctioned." "During the precise moment you claim your life was in danger?" "Yes. Equipment failures happen." "Right," Jordan nodded. "And yet you've worn a body cam for, what, 10 years?" "Roughly." "And how often has it failed during an arrest?" "Not often," Simmons muttered. "But it did this time." Jordan turned to the jury with a slow, deliberate step, letting the absurdity marinate. "So, during one of the most serious altercations of your career, your camera just happened to break. How unlucky." He paused, then delivered the line like a dagger. "And how much luckier that someone nearby had a phone." The gallery stirred like a hive disturbed. The judge's gavel came down like a tired threat. "Mr. Ellis, if you have something, bring it." Jordan retrieved a USB drive with the calm of man lighting a fuse. "Your Honor, the defense submits video captured by a bystander during the arrest." The prosecutor bolted up like a rooster with heartburn. "Objection. This is—" "Sit down," Grayson growled, not bothering to mask his irritation. "Let's see it." The courtroom darkened slightly as the screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky, filmed through a car window, but the audio cut like a razor. Simmons's voice, louder than truth and twice as arrogant. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The crowd froze. Letitia's voice followed, level and unmistakably restrained. "I'm not resisting." "Let go of my arm." Then the shove. Then the line, the one that would haunt Simmons long after his pension hearings. "Women like you don't get to question me." Boom. Every jaw in the room dropped except Letitia's. Hers was locked. The courtroom exploded, gasps, shouts, swearing under breaths. The judge's gavel pounded like a jackhammer, but it was too late. The lie had collapsed under its own theatrical weight. Order was technically restored, but the mood had mutated. Simmons sat slumped, the artificial confidence now replaced with a sheen of sweat and a twitch in his jaw. Letitia, meanwhile, hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Truth had just played its first card, and the room knew the game had changed. What they didn't know, what not even Jordan fully grasped, was that this was only the opening salvo. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. Beside her, Jordan Ellis was pacing like a man who just watched a house of cards collapse, only to realize he was standing in the blueprints. His hands fluttered in midair, part conductor, part caffeine casualty. "This is huge, Letitia," he muttered, turning toward her. "That video just shredded his entire testimony." Letitia didn't even look up. Her hands were folded with the kind of poise usually reserved for UN ambassadors and chess grandmasters. "It's a crack in the wall, Jordan, but cracks don't topple institutions, not unless you know exactly where to press." Jordan exhaled hard, leaning on the table like a man whose spine was giving up on his idealism. We've got the bystander video. We've got your service record. We could bury Simmons before lunch. Letitia's gaze softened, but only slightly. This was never about burying Simmons. He's just the blade. I'm going after the hand that wields it. If we strike too fast, we lose the thread, and they rewrite the story before the truth settles. Timing isn't everything, Jordan. It's the only thing. Before he could answer, the bailiff's voice rang out. Court will reconvene in 5 minutes. Letitia stood, smoothing her blazer with calm precision. Stay sharp. The next 5 minutes will feel like 5 years. For him. When Judge Grayson re-entered, the room held its breath like it already knew something irreversible was about to happen. Simmons, whose earlier swagger now resembled a man trying not to choke on his own collar, sat stiffly, his smirk downgraded to a nervous tick. His backup, the blue wall of fellow officers, looked less like a line of defense and more like a row of tourists who suddenly realized they were on the wrong side of history. Mr. Ellis, the judge said, eyes scanning the room. Do you have additional evidence? Jordan rose with the calculated calm of a man who'd just watched his opponent walk into traffic. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls the defendant, Attorney General Letitia James, to the stand. The room buzzed, no longer skeptical, just stunned. Letitia stood, each step toward the witness chair a lesson in restrained authority. She didn't glance at the gallery, the jury, or Simmons. She didn't have to. Her silence did all the looking for her. When she sat, her back didn't just straighten. It locked into place like a soldier before a tribunal. Ms. James, Jordan began, voice steady. You've heard the accusations. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize his weapon. Are any of them true? No, Letitia replied, clear and unwavering. Then please, Jordan gestured to the jury, tell the court what actually happened. Letitia breathed in slowly. I was walking home after a neighborhood event. I stopped to check directions on my phone. That's when Officer Simmons approached me. He asked what I was doing. I answered. When he asked for my ID, I asked why. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't loitering. I wasn't even loud. I asked for a reason. And what was his reaction? Jordan pressed. He said I was being uncooperative. When I tried to clarify, he grabbed my arm. I told him to let go. He didn't. He tightened his grip. Her jaw stiffened. Then he shoved me into his patrol car. After that, he handcuffed me and claimed I tried to grab his weapon. The courtroom murmured again, but Letitia wasn't done. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about control, about showing someone like me that asking questions was a punishable offense. Jordan let the words sit like a stone dropped in still water. Ms. James, he said slowly, the prosecution has portrayed you as an ordinary civilian who suddenly became combative. Is there something they've left out? Letitia turned to the jury, her eyes harder now. Yes. There is a long pause followed. Then, leaning forward, hands resting at the edge of the stand like a general before battle, she said, I am Letitia James, New York State Attorney General. But before that, I served this country for 20 years as a legal officer in the U.S. Navy, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander. I have worked in combat zones, led investigations into war crimes, and trained operatives in crisis de-escalation. I know what violence looks like, and I know exactly how power is misused under cover of procedure. A wave of gasps swept the room. Judge Grayson froze mid-motion, his gavel hovering like it too needed time to process. Simmons turned pale. palace guard realizing the queen had walked into court with receipts. Jordan stepped forward, voice rising. As someone trained to assess high-pressure situations, did you use that training when Officer Simmons confronted you? Letitia didn't hesitate. Yes, I used it to stay calm, to not react to provocation, to de-escalate without submission, and to remember, silence is compliance, but restraint is not weakness. The room didn't move. Not even the air dared interrupt, and somewhere in that silence, Simmons finally realized he hadn't just picked the wrong target. He'd declared war on a woman who spent her life defending systems he thought she would never question. His story wasn't just unraveling. It was about to be replaced, permanently. I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate the situation, and to protect myself from harm without resorting to violence. Letitia's voice cut clean through the air like a blade honed in a courtroom furnace. Jordan didn't miss a beat. And did you, at any point, attempt to harm Officer Simmons or reach for his weapon? No, she said flatly. My training was never about escalation. It was about discipline, precision, and threat assessment. Simmons wasn't a danger to my safety. He was a danger to my dignity, and I wasn't about to let that badge of his become a license to strip me of it. The words hit like a gavel to the chest. The room reacted in waves, gasps, murmurs, the kind of startled silence that precedes either reverence or revolt. Judge Grayson hammered his gavel, but even his own face betrayed a flicker of something between restraint and reluctant admiration. Order! I will have order in this court. Once the room cooled back to a low simmer, Jordan turned to the jury, his tone quiet but sharpened with gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you've heard Officer Simmons' polished narrative, delivered with the confidence of someone who assumed no one would question him. And now, you've heard the truth from a woman who has spent her life defending this country, who understands authority, but more importantly, understands when it's being abused. So I'll ask just one thing. Who do you believe? At the prosecution's table, Richard Avery remained seated, face frozen, eyes locked on a point of shame somewhere on the carpet. Simmons, for his part, sat statue still, except for the tremor in his hands gripping the chair arms like a man holding on to the last seconds of a career unraveling in real time. Letitia stepped down with military calm, returned to her seat, and leaned in. Now, she murmured to Jordan, just loud enough for him to hear, let's see how long that blue wall holds before it caves on itself. The tension in the courtroom became something physical, heavy, like the air before a storm. Simmons sat at the plaintiff's table, pale and glistening, as though the truth had turned up the room's temperature. His fellow officers in the gallery, who had come in with straight backs and folded arms, now exchanged glances that looked more like negotiations than solidarity. The great wall of silent support had acquired cracks. Judge Grayson looked around the room, his voice tired but deliberate. Mr. Avery, does the prosecution wish to proceed with redirect, or would you prefer to revisit your entire career path? Avery rose stiffly, the posture of a man trying to convince himself this wasn't a disaster. Your Honor, we'd like to recall Officer Simmons to the stand to clarify inconsistencies. Translation: patch the Titanic with duct tape. Proceed, Grayson replied dryly. Simmons stood like he'd been sentenced already. No swagger now, just slow, creaky movement, like someone walking toward a podium at his own disciplinary hearing. He didn't look at Letitia, but Letitia never took her eyes off him. When he sat, his hand shook slightly as he adjusted the mic. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Hell, the bailiff probably noticed. Avery approached like a man delivering an apology disguised as a question. "Officer Simmons, you've heard the defendant's testimony. Do you have anything to say?" Simmons cleared his throat, grasping for credibility like it might grow back if he just spoke louder. "Yes, her version of events is exaggerated. I acted within the scope of my duties." Avery forced a smile. "And the video evidence? How do you explain what the court saw?" A pause. Too long. "The video doesn't show everything. It's out of context." "And what context would that be?" Avery pressed, now more desperate than prosecutorial. Simmons' voice rose like volume could substitute for logic. She was defiant. She questioned my authority. I had to act decisively to maintain control. Letitia didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look on her face, cool, composed, mildly pitying, said enough. Jordan leaned over. "He's unraveling." She nodded once, not triumphant, just aware. Avery pushed forward, voice sharp. "You stand by your claim that she reached for your weapon?" "Yes," Simmons said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. "She made a sudden movement. I had to protect myself." Jordan was on his feet before the echo faded. "Your Honor, permission to cross." "Granted," the judge replied, barely masking his boredom. He, too, had seen this show before, and knew exactly how it ended. Jordan approached the stand with a calm that was almost disrespectful. He didn't rush, didn't bark, just let silence grow fat around Simmons like a second caller. "Officer Simmons," he said finally, voice smooth, "you've repeated this claim under oath. That my client reached for your weapon, correct?" "Yes," Simmons replied, the word barely hanging on to its own certainty. And with that single answer, the lie grew legs just long enough to walk itself to the edge of the cliff. What came next wouldn't be cross-examination. It would be exposure. Systemic, public, and irreversible. "And yet," Jordan continued, his voice as steady as a scalpel, "you've offered no physical evidence to support this allegation. No fingerprints on your holster. No eyewitness testimony. Not even a scuffed belt. Just your word." Simmons' jaw tightened, a flash of indignation rising, but failing to anchor. "I know what I saw," he insisted. "Of course you do." Jordan nodded, the sarcasm coated so thinly it could pass for sincerity, until it didn't. "You know what you saw. But the court has seen something else. Video evidence. Unfiltered. Unnarrated. And, unlike your recollection, it shows a calm, law-abiding woman being handled like a felon before she had the chance to finish a sentence." "And you say that's context?" Simmons raised his voice. "That video is incomplete. It's out of context." "Out of context," Jordan repeated slowly, as though tasting the words for the first time. "Let's talk about context, then." He turned to the jury, his voice rising like a tide they couldn't escape. "Here's the context. A man with a badge and unchecked power stopped a civilian for doing what every New Yorker does daily, checking their phone on a sidewalk. No crime, no probable cause. And when questioned, he responded not with answers, but with force. Then he doubled down, on the street, in his report, and under oath." Avery sprang from his seat like a broken spring. "Objection." "Overruled," Grayson snapped, before the word even finished echoing. Jordan turned back to Simmons, dropping his tone to a near whisper. "Officer Simmons, you accuse the sitting Attorney General of New York, who served this country in uniform longer than you've worn one, of being a threat. not because of her actions, but because of your assumptions. Tell me, does it embarrass you to know that the woman you tried to intimidate has faced war zones, death squads, and hostile governments without flinching, yet here you are, rattled by a sidewalk and a cell phone? Simmons flinched, and with that flinch, the jury saw everything. The manufactured poise, the hollow certainty, the brittle script. That's irrelevant, Simmons muttered. She wasn't acting like a Navy SEAL that night. Jordan's smile returned, sharp and cold. And you weren't acting like a police officer. The pause after that line wasn't silence. It was agreement, too stunned to speak. You acted like a man used to being obeyed, not questioned. A man who thought power equals permission. And what you didn't count on, Officer Simmons, was someone finally saying no. Simmons opened his mouth, but the words never came. Jordan turned toward the judge. No further questions. Simmons stepped down like a man being gently pushed off a ledge, shoulders sagging, eyes down. He returned to the plaintiff's table, where his fellow officers now sat stone still, hands folded, but eyes everywhere else but him. Letitia, ever composed, watched with quiet intensity before leaning to Jordan. The wall's starting to crumble. Jordan nodded, barely able to hide the grin forming at the corner of his mouth. Then, let's finish what we started. The courtroom remained thick with silence. A different kind of silence. This wasn't suspense, it was consequence. Simmons looked like a man drowning in his own uniform, while the jury exchanged glances that screamed they're starting to see it. Even Judge Grayson, who had mastered the art of judicial apathy, leaned forward slightly, as if gravity had finally chosen a side. Letitia sat still, unmoved, yet more commanding than any badge in the room. Jordan flipped through his notes with a kind of finality that signaled this was no longer litigation. It was reckoning. "Your Honor," he said, voice taut with purpose, "the defense has one final piece of evidence, one that will end the debate." The gallery buzzed. The jury straightened. Simmons gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Avery tensed like he was waiting for someone to shout, "Incoming!" Letitia simply stared ahead, calm and deadly. Jordan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, raising the folder like a scalpel. "You've been asked to choose between two realities, that of a public servant with an unblemished record, and that of a man whose credibility now hangs by a thread. This," he said, flipping open the folder, "is Officer Simmons's personnel file." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection, irrelevant and prejudicial." Judge Grayson raised a hand, his voice firm. "Overruled. Mr. Ellis, proceed." Jordan nodded, addressing the jury directly. Over the course of his career, Officer Simmons has accumulated multiple formal complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, retaliatory conduct. Most of them swept under the rug, some quietly closed, none meaningfully addressed. He passed copies of the documents to the jury, watching their expressions shift. One juror raised an eyebrow, another shook their head. "This case was never just about a single moment," Jordan continued. "It's about a pattern, and that pattern speaks louder than any uniform ever could." Simmons sat frozen, lips tight, throat twitching. Avery looked like he wanted to disappear into his own lapels. The room wasn't just listening anymore. It was realizing, and in that realization came the truth. Simmons wasn't the exception. He was the product, and the reckoning was just beginning. These complaints weren't just ignored. They were filed, reviewed, and then ceremoniously buried under the same bureaucratic rug that's been choking accountability for decades. But today, the rug was yanked back in front of a jury that now held the stench of systemic rot in their hands. Jordan handed the personnel records to each juror like a surgeon revealing the infection beneath the surface wound. The murmurs in the gallery grew bolder, disgusted gasps mixing with incredulous whispers. Even Judge Grayson, who had spent most of the trial projecting polished neutrality, showed the faintest flicker of something darker as he scanned the documents. A furrow in his brow, a clenched jaw. Perhaps recognition that the system he presided over had let this happen. Again. Jordan's voice rose, not in volume, but in weight. "Let's be clear," he said, letting each syllable land like a hammer. "This is not about one mistake. This is not about one night. This is about a pattern of violence masquerading as policy, a pattern of intimidation branded as protocol, a pattern that culminated in the false arrest, the public humiliation, and the outright fabrication of charges against my client." He turned toward Letitia. "And now, she will speak for herself." Letitia stood slowly, with the gravity of someone accustomed to briefing war rooms, not begging courtrooms. She walked to the front of the chamber and faced the jury, not just with presence, but with purpose. "My name is Letitia James," she began, her voice ringing clear in the rafters. "I served 20 years in the United States Navy, retiring as a lieutenant commander. I've operated in combat zones, navigated international crises, and trained others to uphold the very law I was accused of defying. I have always held myself to the highest standards of conduct, because integrity, when worn honestly, is heavier than any uniform." Her eyes swept the jury, then the gallery, then Simmons. But the enemy I faced that night didn't wear a different flag or speak a different tongue. He wore a badge from my own city. He saw me standing on a public sidewalk and decided that was a problem. Not because I broke the law, but because I dared to exist on my own terms. Because I didn't shrink. Because I asked a question. The room had gone still, dead still. Not even the judge dared interrupt. Officer Simmons didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a threat to his control. But what he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that I don't yield to bullies, foreign or domestic. She turned directly to Simmons, who now stared at the floor as if it might open up and swallow him. "You underestimated me. But worse, you underestimated the truth. And the truth does not fade in the shadow of authority. It shines brighter." A hush fell again, but it was different now. Heavier, sharper. When Letitia turned to face the judge, her final words came with the precision of a closing statement carved in steel. "Your Honor, I have fought for this country. I have prosecuted injustice. And today, I fight not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been targeted by the very people sworn to protect them." The room erupted. Applause broke through despite the gavel's protest. "Order!" Grayson barked, though there was no fire behind it. Even he couldn't mask the begrudging respect in his expression. Jordan stepped forward, rested a hand on Letitia's shoulder, and said, "Thank you, Attorney General James." No further questions. As Letitia returned to her seat, the energy in the room shifted decisively. The jury's gaze held something different now. Conviction. Not about guilt or innocence, but about purpose. Simmons, meanwhile, had shrunk into a posture more familiar to defendants than officers of the law. His once proud frame now curled, his shoulders sagging like a statue after a toppling. Even his colleagues in the gallery looked away. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, this time sounding every bit the exhausted gatekeeper of a system cracking under its own mythology. We will now move to closing arguments. I suggest both parties choose their words carefully. The air congealed again, this time with suspense, as Richard Avery stood. The man who once barked with the confidence of the law now sounded like a bureaucrat explaining a parking ticket. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice more apologetic than persuasive, "this is a complicated case." He paused, glancing nervously at Simmons. Law enforcement officers are required to make difficult decisions in real time. Officer Simmons believed he was acting in the best interest of public safety. He dared not look at Letitia. Were there mistakes made? Perhaps, but that doesn't negate the facts. The defendant resisted, escalated, and defied lawful instructions. I urge you not to be swayed by dramatic testimony or spectacle. He ended flatly. Look at the facts. Thank you. He sat, exhaling like a man who knew the jury wasn't buying it. Jordan rose next, slowly. He didn't need theatrics. The truth had already performed its own drama. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice firm, "this is not a complex case. This is a painfully simple one. My client, Letitia James, is a decorated veteran, a lifelong public servant, and a defender of justice. She was profiled, intimidated, and lied about by a man who believed his badge gave him impunity." He took one step closer. "This trial is not just about justice for her. It's a referendum on what we tolerate in those we empower. Do we accept lies wrapped in procedure, or do we insist that power answer to truth?" He paused, letting the silence ask the question with him. "I trust you to choose what's right." And as he sat, the courtroom didn't breathe. It waited, because the reckoning wasn't theoretical anymore. It was personal, and it was coming next. He turned toward Letitia, who sat poised with the stillness of someone who'd endured far worse in silence. Back straight, hands folded, eyes steady. Letitia James did not resist arrest, Jordan declared, each word etched with conviction. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not scream, threaten, or flee. What she did was ask a question. Why? And for that, she was slammed against a patrol car, handcuffed in public, and paraded through a lie dressed in protocol. His voice rose, ignited now by something deeper than performance. This isn't just about Letitia. This is about power with no restraint. It's about badges used like blunt instruments rather than shields. When one man betrays the oath and the system shields him, the betrayal becomes collective. He stepped closer to the jury, his voice softening just enough to land hard. Today, you hold more than a verdict. You hold the opportunity to say that truth matters, that justice isn't a slogan, it's a standard, and that no uniform, no title, no weapon should ever place someone above the law. Jordan sat down. The room exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was weight. Judge Grayson gave his instructions to the jury in clipped tones. Then they were gone, deliberating. And the waiting began. In the hallway, Letitia sat like a statue carved from war and dignity, her fingers clasped tightly. Jordan paced, a man doing mental math he could never quite trust. Conversations buzzed around them, journalists hypothesizing, spectators whispering, camera lenses adjusting in anticipation. None of it reached her. She was somewhere deeper. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" Jordan asked, his voice quiet. Not for privacy, but reverence. Letitia didn't even blink. "They don't need to see it, Ben. They need to feel it. and if they do, they'll know. Before he could respond, the bailiff appeared in the doorway like the closing act of a long play. The jury has reached a verdict. No one moved at first, then everything moved at once. Back in the courtroom, bodies filed in like shadows under fluorescent light. The air turned leaden with anticipation. Letitia stood at the defense table, expression unreadable, hands calmly resting in front of her. Simmons sat across from her, rigid, his stare locked on the jury as though trying to will them back into his version of events. The foreperson rose. A woman with kind eyes, but today she looked more like a scalpel. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Grayson asked. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "Please read it." She unfolded the paper. "In the case of State versus Letitia James, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." It was as if the room sighed in unison. Gasps, whispers, the stifled sob of a reporter who hadn't expected to feel anything. The judge's gavel fought to contain it, but the damage, or the restoration, was already done. Letitia's shoulders dropped for the first time in days, and Jordan placed a hand on her shoulder, his usual restraint cracking into a quiet smile. The foreperson continued. "Furthermore, we, the jury, strongly recommend that an investigation into Officer Simmons' conduct be pursued." Judge Grayson didn't hesitate. "The court will take this recommendation under advisement. Officer Simmons, I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over." Outside, the courthouse became a flashpoint. Cameras, questions, chaos. But Letitia stood tall. She wasn't there for spectacle. She was there to finish the mission. "This isn't just my victory," she said to the crowd, her voice calm but resonant. "This is a victory for accountability, for truth, and for anyone who's ever been told to shut up and take it. I didn't fight this battle alone, and I'm not done fighting." Jordan stood beside her, silent and proud. The crowd broke into applause, not for drama, but for defiance that refused to die quietly. Letitia turned and walked away, not toward the cameras, but through them, like someone who didn't need to be followed to make history. Months later, Simmons was dismissed from the department. His misconduct, once dismissed as paperwork noise, became the subject of criminal charges. The blue wall that once protected him became a scaffold for his fall. His former colleagues, once so confident in his word, no longer returned his calls. Letitia returned to her life, but not to obscurity. Her name became a rallying cry, a symbol of standing tall when the system leans hard. Invitations came from universities, legal forums, veterans groups. People who had been afraid to speak before now found their voices, thanks to hers. She had left the battlefield, but her war for justice had simply changed terrain. Because for Letitia James, justice wasn't a courtroom verdict. It was a calling. And when the system lies, it takes a certain kind of warrior to force it to confess, and that's how the truth prevailed, not with fireworks, but with calm fury and unwavering resolve. If her story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more voices that challenge power and stand for the forgotten. Justice isn't just a headline. It's a decision, and the next one might be yours.